Can architecture be psychoanalyzed? My suggestion is to say, architecture, like psychoanalysis, depends fundamentally on the distinction between meanings and meaningfulness. The next step is to show how this distinction explains the function of metaphor in relation to Lacan's claim that there is no such thing as literal meaning. Normally, metaphor is the poetic replacement of a conventional word. For Lacan, it's the general basis for the symbolic as such. Lacan's metaphor shows that there can be meaningfulness without meanings, and, in effect, no meta-language in psychoanalysis. Metaphor is what distinguishes Lacanian psychoanalysis from other therapies and extends it into cultural practices, including the creation and use of architecture. Metaphor as structure is key to the way that the unconscious relates to the aims of analysis. In the L-schema, the symbolic is at right angles to the imaginary that contains the analyst and the analysand as two egos in a Euclidean space. The symbolic of the unconscious must slip past, thanks to the difference that separates meaningfulness from meanings. The analyst plays a strategy based on the fact that the former always seems to be beyond words, and yet every analysand says more than she or he intends. The analyst plays the role of the dummy in bridge, coming in late to underscore a slip of the tongue, or by nudging the analysand to say a bit more. Early and late are like the goalposts, giving the unconscious a chance to bolt through the analysand's lips. Meaningfulness is an experience rather than an explanation. Metaphor is a form of this early and late, providing something in experience that seems first, but is actually grounded on something that is logically prior. The L-schema shows the symbolic and imaginary running against each other. This self-intersection is none other than the après-coup. This is the way the end of the sentence retroactively informs the beginning of the sentence. What we hear is magnetized by latent meanings we find only later on. Latency first occurs inside Euclidean virtuality, the invisible behind the visible, but it logically engages a temporality. This temporality comes out in the dream because the dream needs to immobilize the dreamer. The waking subject's freedom to move around and the sleeper's paralysis are a clear contrast. But it's also about Lacanian extimity. When we look at the après-coup, we see this contrast in the simplest graphic expression. For waking experience, the latency of the dream is already a geometry, a motion, and the uncanny possibility that the dream might contaminate reality. For the dream, it is the paralysis of the point of view, producing phantasmagoria. Metaphor is Lacan's second program for latency. If we see his complicated matheme dynamically, we can see latency pulse down the chains of signifiers, magnetizing them and the subject with an unknown X. This pulse flips and intersects itself to replicate the après-coup form. Experience encounters meaningfulness first, on the right side of the equal sign, only to cycle back to a logical first on the left. Metaphor holds the head of signifiers below the water of the bar, forcing them to resonate like a bell. This is a trauma that links with another real at the end of the process on the right, a termination of the dictionary's endless replacement of signifiers with other signifiers. Metaphor gives us, instead, a self-intersecting void through the après-coup of extimity. The void is not just a hole punched in reality. It is a composite that structures its own circumference. These are the lips, labias, and aureoles of the body, as well as the porticos, sills, and parapets of architecture, or the forums of the city. These are the two early spaces, where latency comes in the form of conditional entry and interrogation, or the just after of the ancient labyrinth, architecture's logical emblem. The void connects psychoanalysis to customs, rituals, and mythology, but it also justifies our use of the new term analytical architecture. Analysis begins by sorting out analysands precisely on their relation to meaningfulness distinctions. Neurotics are obsessed with meanings. Psychotics and perverts swim in meaningfulness. But because metaphor shows how latency exists for everyone, it allows us to say that architecture is simultaneously psychotic and perverse. Metaphor's après-coup is the foundational logic of the death drive, configured as non-orientation and self-intersection. These experiential aspects of projective geometry establish subjectivity not just for individual subjects, but collectively. So we might regard metaphor's extimate geometry as a cultural basis for folk practices, mythologies, rituals, as well as for contemporary art, literature, and of course, architecture. We describe meaningfulness as non-Euclidean, but this is a misnomer. Although Euclid comes first historically, it is not primary in logical terms. Projective geometry is foundational to Euclid. So the question is, what was projective geometry before it was discovered in 300 AD? What was it logically when it was historically latent? This is the après-coup of metaphor. Latency formations force a retroactive return to a trauma at the level of signifiers, a sudden suppression of a signifier that was replaced by a nothing, a pure cause without any content or meaning, for the signified immediately folds in on itself to open up a void. In myth and ritual, these traumas are the form given to non-orientation and self-intersection. The German philosopher Ernst Cassirer, interpreting 3 of Goethe's maxims, put the matter in a very Lacanian way. The unconscious makes what seems to be a conscious decision to make itself suffer in the forms of the world, or specifically to create its own suffering by activating perceptual consciousness in such a way that the unconscious will be trapped by the very decision to escape. This is a strange way to think of things, but it fits precisely within the matheme of metaphor and with what Lacan says so mysteriously in Seminar 7, The Ethics of Psychoanalysis. The trap is self-constructed and self-maintained. Like the story of Daphne and Apollo, the same arrow that inflames love in Apollo poisons Daphne with hate, the same arrow that points up on one side of the Mobius band, only to return to its starting point in a down direction. Lacan, too, calls this a surface defined by pursuit and flight, a surface of pain, and employs the logic of the self-immersed 2D manifolds of projective geometry to play out the details of this immersion as the consequences of metaphor in the role of efficient cause. There is a clear way to connect Cassirer's idea of a basis phenomenon to the possibility of an analytical architecture metaphor's après-coup fold of the experience of the signifying chain back onto its logical origins. I would go so far as to say that unless this is done, there can be no further progress on the matter. From Goethe to Cassirer to Lacan to us, the basis phenomenon is about the continuum that joins mind and world into what Susan Buck-Morss has shown to be a single circuit, but this circuit cannot be mapped from above. There is no meta-language. Instead, we have only the option of considering the basis phenomenon as a logical prime and the basis for metaphor as a second kind of virtuality. I would expand Jacques-Alain Miller's claim that extimity lies at the bottom of all of Lacan's ideas to explain the difference between our Euclidean waking experience and our idempotential experience in dreams. The Gestalt analogy of the figure over the ground conceives subjectivity as autonomous and self-directing, but in the dream, this figure across ground logic must be reversed. The dream keeps the dreamer asleep by immobilizing it, but the dreamer continues to think Euclid. When the dream logic conflicts with Euclidean logic, phantasmagoria is deployed to save the day. This defense is like what computer programmers use to defend against denial of service attacks, where hackers flood a website with simultaneous demands. Defending the sleeper from such attacks from external or internal threats to sleep is the same idea, called idempotency. The best example I know of to illustrate this is the 1998 film The Truman Show, about a television series built around a single character who is surrounded by actors who pretend to be his neighbors and friends in the island town of Sea Haven. But Sea Haven is completely covered by a weather-controlled dome which simulates seasons, day and night, and weather conditions. The show's suspense comes directly from idempotency. The suspense is to see how long Truman can be kept from realizing his position as an immobilized dreamer. Occasionally, a piece of production equipment malfunctions. His desires are kept in line by the producer's schemes to provide a complete phantasmagoria simulating a normal life, but the uncanny breaks through enough to compel Truman to break out of his dream into something he can't imagine, a world where his fake freedom becomes real freedom. At the point where he is able to escape, the producer Christoph tries to persuade him that paralysis within Sea Haven is infinitely better than waking up to reality on the outside. A final example comes from the 1945 British thriller Dead of Night. A well-to-do socialite gives her fiancé an antique mirror, without knowing that the mirror's first owner had been immobilized by a riding accident. When his restless wife began to cheat on him, he strangled her in a jealous rage in front of the mirror that hung in his bedroom. The traumatic event was pulled into the mirror, which itself was idempotently fixed to the wall. The mirror had to create a latent space, a space that could only be returned to a viewer whose profile matched that of the original jealous husband. The new husband is gradually pulled into this secondary virtuality, at first with glimpses of a room behind him other than his own. The latent room takes over whenever the wife is away. He stares at it, immobilized like the former owner, to the point where he decides to murder his wife. This uncanny tale illustrates with remarkable economy what happens in architecture, and what makes architecture in need of analysis. Like the haunted mirror, architecture creates voids that are, in Cassirer's words, like a conscious decision to make itself suffer in the forms of this world. Specifically, to create its own suffering by activating perceptual consciousness in such a way that the unconscious will be trapped by the very decision to escape. Here is a definition of the unconscious in a nutshell. The wife, a good analyst, figures out the problem and smashes the mirror. She allows the debt that created the latency to be paid in full. In architecture, the debts are stored in vortices and spiraling symmetries made pathological by the Baroque, but are in fact the essential psychotic ingredient of any authentic architecture. They are the poison that is simultaneously a cure. Lacan's metaphor matheme becomes a plan of action for applying its structure to the uncanny narrative, where a secondary virtuality packs the mirror with its non-Euclidean traumatic memory. This allows the figure-ground relationships of the normal reflection to switch, so that the room that would be the ground now moves across the immobilized new husband, applying the rule of idempotency. In short, if we understand metaphor as a plan for distributing latency to immobilize the subject, we can understand the function of the curse and the gift entirely as an exchange of signifiers. What's confusing about Lacan's metaphor matheme can be cleared up by looking just at the operators, the graphic signs. We see the bars as all the same. We see how the drowning of the first signifier led to a resonance, then a protective enclosure. Most important, however, is the left-to-right symmetry that makes the haunted mirror a model for the kind of metaphor that lies at the basis of all thought, which is fundamentally the ethnography of architecture, an architecture that we can properly call analytical architecture.